Ever get the feeling that some companies, well, it's like they're trying to slap on a new coat of paint, try to look all shiny and new, but underneath, it's like the same old. Like
Yeah.
the foundation is still stuck in the Stone Age.
Right. It's all surface level.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this whole idea of like culture versus structure. We talk a lot about company culture, but how often do we really think about the structures that are like the backbone of those organizations?
Yeah, it's one of those things that's often invisible, until you bump into it.
Exactly. And you were particularly interested in, why is it that even when companies have the best intentions, like they genuinely want to create a positive, supportive culture, it still falls flat? And that article you shared, Culture versus Structure, why Larman's laws suggest structure always wins. I mean, it's like they were reading our minds, right?
It really is spot on. I think what it does so well is highlight how structure, it's not just about org charts and reporting lines. It's like this invisible architect. It shapes behavior in ways we often don't even realize.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. So on the one hand, we've got culture, right? And that's the vibes, the values, the unwritten rules, all that jazz. And then we've got structure, which is more like the formal stuff, the org chart, who's calling the shots, who reports to whom.
Exactly. And what Larman does with these laws, these 4 laws, is provide this framework for understanding why, more often than not, structure ends up being the boss, even when companies are saying, oh, we're all about this other, cool collaborative culture.
And that's why these laws are so key for our deep dive today. So for anyone listening who's like, wait, Larman's laws, is that like a new physics equation? Imagine it this way. Imagine you're looking at a company through 4 different lenses, right? Each lens gives you a different perspective on how power and change actually work in that organization, not just like the PR version.
Yeah, I like that. The lens analogy, it's very fitting.
Right. So lens number 1, Larman's Law 1, it states, organizations are implicitly optimized to avoid changing the status quo of the power structure and values of the people currently in power. In other words, companies are basically hardwired to resist anything that might threaten the top dogs.
It's like self-preservation, but on an organizational level.
Totally. And that takes us to Law 2, which flows directly from that first one. It says, as a corollary to Larman's Law 1, any change initiative draws criticism from those whose power or status is threatened by the change. You start messing with the power dynamics, someone's going to raise an eyebrow.
Oh, at least an eyebrow.
Yeah.
More like, sound the alarm bells.
Right. And that leads us nicely to Law 3, which also piggybacks on that first one. As a corollary to Larman's Law 1, the status quo of middle managers is to be preserved by default. And this one is so interesting because it highlights how middle managers, they're often the ones like holding the keys to how things actually get done, right? So naturally, they might resist things that shake up their domain.
They're often caught in the middle too, right? Between the top-down directives and the day-to-day realities on the ground.
Exactly. And then we get to like the mic drops, the grand finale, Larman's Law 4, culture follows structure, meaning you can talk all you want about collaboration and innovation and all those buzzwords. But if your structure screams like hierarchy and top-down control, well, actions speak louder than words, am I right?
It's like that saying, you can put lipstick on a pig, but...
It's still a pig. Exactly. And that's where those real-world examples that the article gets into, they become so fascinating.
Because we've all experienced this, right? This disconnect between what a company says it values and how it actually operates.
Oh, tell me about it. Like, that time our volunteer group tried to be more inclusive in our decision-making. We wanted everyone to have a voice.
But then the way we ran meetings, it was like, okay, here's the agenda, here are the pre-assigned roles, and you could just feel that energy, that open collaborative energy just kind of fizzle out.
Totally. It's like trying to have a spontaneous jam session with a bunch of, like, sheet music police around.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of real-world examples, that's a perfect segue into breaking down these Larman's laws, because
Right.
I think sometimes we can get bogged down in the theory, and I'm all about, like, okay, great concept, but how does this actually play out in a company, in the wild?
Absolutely. And the article gives us some really great examples, starting with Law 1, that whole, organizations are hardwired to protect the powers that be.
Right.
They use traditional hierarchies as an example, which, let's be honest, those are about as common as, stale coffee in a break room.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
Painfully common.
Right. And what they point out is that even when there's a genuine desire, at the top, to say, okay, we want to be more innovative or we want to encourage more risk-taking, the structure itself can actually sabotage those efforts.
Because it's like you can say you want one thing, but if the system is built to do the opposite,
Exactly. It's like imagine you're trying to, I don't know, water a garden with a thimble, right? You might have the best intentions, but the tool you're using just isn't designed for the job.
Okay, that's a really good analogy because it highlights how that top-down structure, it inherently concentrates decision-making power.
Yeah.
Right. So even if a CEO is like, hey, we value your ideas, everyone's got a voice, if the structure is still like every idea has to go through 17 layers of approval.
It just gets bogged down, right? Look at that poor little plant trying to get watered with a thimble.
Exactly. Which brings us to the whole pushback thing, Larman's law, too, because you start shifting those power dynamics. Someone's going to feel a little, shall we say, uneasy.
Oh, uneasy is putting it mildly. It's like imagine you're used to navigating your house in the dark. You know where everything is. You can walk around with your eyes closed. And then someone comes in and rearranges all the furniture.
Oh my gosh, I would be terrified.
Right. You're going to bump into some things. You're going to be disoriented. And in an organizational context, that disorientation, it often manifests as resistance to the change.
Right. And the article gives a great example of this with those like agile transformations that are so hot right now. Companies are trying to move away from these rigid hierarchies. They want to create these nimble, self-managing teams. But for middle managers who are used to like controlling the project timelines, the budgets, the resources, it can feel like the rug is being pulled out from under them.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember it's not always like malicious resistance. Sometimes it's just fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing your expertise, maybe even fear of not being needed anymore.
So it's not about demonizing those who push back. It's about understanding where they're coming from.
Exactly. And then finding ways to, manage that resistance strategically. The article talks about the importance of involving those middle managers in the process, finding ways to leverage their skills and experience within the new structure. Maybe they become like mentors to those self-managing teams, sharing their expertise, helping them navigate roadblocks.
It's about turning potential resistors into champions. Because if they feel ownership over that new structure, they're more likely to embrace the cultural shifts that come with it.
Exactly. And that takes us to Law 3, which is all about those middle managers, right? The middle manager conundrum.
Right.
Because they're often stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they're getting these like top-down directives to implement all these changes, to disrupt the very structures that they've been operating within, sometimes for their entire careers.
And the article uses government agencies as an example, which, I mean, we all know how bureaucratic those can be.
Oh, tell me about it.
And so while there might be this big push for like cross-functional collaboration, breaking down silos, those middle managers are often incentivized to protect their little fiefdoms.
Because in that kind of rigid structure, knowledge is power. And those fiefdoms, those departments, they represent their domain expertise. So letting go of that control, blurring the lines between departments, it can feel very threatening to them.
It's like their sense of authority is tied to maintaining those boundaries.
Exactly. And that kind of environment, it breeds a culture of siloed thinking, right? Where people are more invested in protecting their turf than they are in collaborating towards a common goal.
Which, ironically, is often the opposite of what those top-level directives are trying to achieve.
Exactly. And it all circles back to Larman's law for the big reveal. Culture follows structure.
You want a specific kind of culture, you better build the structures to support it. Otherwise, it's all just lip service.
It's like putting, well, we already used the pig analogy, but you get the idea. You can't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. Structure speaks volumes.
And that's where those real-world examples really hit home. Like the article talks about Google, for instance.
Yeah.
They've got this like legendary reputation for being innovative.
Rightfully so.
And it's not just because they've got like ping pong tables and kombucha on tap, right?
It's definitely not just the perks.
The article talks about how their structure, the way they're organized, it actually empowers that innovation. They've got these cross-functional teams, decentralized decision-making, a relatively flat hierarchy. It's like their structure is designed to say yes to new ideas.
Whereas in a more traditional company, it's often no until proven otherwise.
Exactly. And then you've got companies like General Electric, which, they were once at the forefront of innovation.
Oh, yeah. They were like the gold standard.
But in recent decades, they've struggled to keep up. And what does the article point to as a major culprit? Their rigid bureaucratic structure.
All those layers of management, those siloed departments, it creates this culture where people are afraid to, rock the boat too much.
Because in that kind of structure, rocking the boat, it can be career suicide.
Right. Who wants to risk their neck proposing a bold new idea when it's just going to get stuck in committee?
It's a classic case of the structure stifling innovation, even when the intention might be there.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the Zappos example. Remember when they went all in on holacracy?
Oh, yeah. That
Yeah.
was like the ultimate experiment in self-management, right?
Yeah.
No job titles, no traditional hierarchy. It was like they threw the whole org chart out the window.
It was radical. And while the intention was amazing to create this incredibly flat, agile, responsive organization, the execution was, shall we say, a bit bumpy.
Because as the article points out, you can go too far in the other direction, right?
Ah.
Ditching all else structure can be just as problematic as clinging to a rigid one.
It's all about finding that balance.
Like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold.
Exactly. And that's where those actionable strategies that the article outlines become so valuable.
It's finding that sweet spot, right? Like you want just the right amount of structure to provide support and guidance, but not so much that it stifles creativity, that it gets in the way of people being able to respond to things quickly,
Yeah.
adapt to new information.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between structure and freedom.
Hmm.
And what I appreciate about the actionable strategies that the article outlines, for people who are like, okay, this is all very interesting, but what do I do with this information? It's not just some theoretical wish list. It's rooted in real world application. Like one of the things that really resonated with me was that point about involving employees in the design of new structures.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's not about just the powers that be going into a room, drawing up a new org chart, and then being like, all right, everybody, this is how it's going to be from now on.
Exactly. It's about co-creation, bringing people along on that journey, making them feel heard.
Because that's how you build ownership, right?
Uh,
When people feel like they've had a voice in shaping the structures they're operating within, they're way more likely to be on board with the whole thing.
Absolutely. And that ties into another strategy the article talks about, which is that clear, consistent communication throughout the entire process.
Oh, communication, the magic word, right?
Right. Because people are much more likely to embrace change, even if it's uncomfortable, if they understand the why behind it. Like, okay, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's how it benefits you, here's how your role fits into the bigger picture.
It's like that old saying, people don't fear change, they fear the unknown. So it's about shining a light on that unknown.
Exactly. Make it feel less threatening. And often you'll find that resistance starts to decrease when people feel informed and included.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the importance of addressing concerns head on.
Yeah.
Because change is messy, right? There are going to be bumps along the way. People are going to have questions, maybe even some anxieties.
For sure. And the article talks about how important it is to create that safe space for people to voice those anxieties, to ask those dumb questions.
Because there are no dumb questions when it comes to something as important as how you're structured at work.
Right. Exactly. It's about building trust, knowing that their voices are being heard, that their concerns are being taken seriously.
Because I think if people feel like their concerns are being, dismissed or ignored, that's when resistance can turn into resentment.
Oh, absolutely. And that can be toxic to any culture, no matter how well-intentioned you are.
It's like that's when you get that negativity, that cynicism, it just seeps into everything.
Exactly. And that takes us to another really important point, which is that organizational change, it's not a one-and-done deal.
Right. It's not like you just flip a switch and suddenly, boom, you've got the perfect culture.
It's a journey, right? It's an ongoing process of adaptation, of refinement. What works today might not work tomorrow, so building in those mechanisms for feedback, for continuous improvement, that's essential.
It's like tending a garden. You can't just plant some seeds and then just walk away and expect them to magically thrive.
What a great analogy.
You got to water them. You got to weed out the things that aren't working, maybe add some fertilizer along the way. You've got to nurture that growth.
I love that. It really captures that sense of ongoing nurturing and adaptation that's so crucial for building a healthy organizational culture.
And I think that's a great note to wrap up our deep dive on culture versus structure. We covered a lot of ground, from Larman's laws and how they kind of expose those hidden power dynamics within organizations to those real-world examples of companies that have either, totally rocked it or maybe stumbled a bit along the way.
We've all been there.
But if there's one key takeaway I hope you walk away with today, it's that culture and structure. They're not separate things.
They're inextricably linked, two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. So as you go about your day, as you interact with different organizations, whether it's at work, in your community, or wherever, don't be afraid to ask those questions. Like, how does the structure of this organization actually shape people's behavior? Does it support the kind of culture they say they're striving for?
Those are great questions to ask.
Because ultimately, we all deserve to be part of organizations where the structures are working for us, not against us, right?
Couldn't agree more.
A huge thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little bit eye-opening. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, structure might seem like that silent partner in organizational life, but it's got a much bigger influence on the culture we experience every day than we often realize.